When I was growing up and living in the suburbs, it was always my plan to move into the city when I was old enough. I didn't learn to drive a car and took trains and buses everywhere that I went. There didn't seem much a point to having a car and living in the city to me, when all having a car would do was cost you even more money, difficulty parking, and other such troubles. Things weren't exactly great at home with my parents. They were the sort who said things that made you really believe they wanted their kids out of the house ASAP. They didn't encourage me to go to college or anything like that, and so I didn't ever make plans to do so. My life basically had me moving out when I was forced to, and then probably working at a fast food or retail job for a long time. I graduated a semester early, simply because I could. That also meant that since I wasn't going to college, I had to start looking for a new place to live. The semester's finals were over with in January, so that's when I would start looking. I lived outside a large northern city, so the winter was going to be very rough, and it was going to be difficult looking for a place to live nearby. I had a job working in the suburbs. I was going to be doing the opposite of what most people did. People tended to live in the suburbs and go to work in the city. However, I had seen the fast food and retail places of the city, and I had no desire to work there. I wanted to live there but planned on keeping my job out in the suburbs. Plus, going backward against rush hour on the trains might be a pleasant experience. Well, I immediately found the real difficulty in finding a place to live. I was an 18-year-old high school graduate with no credit history or living references. I didn't want to get a roommate either. I wanted to find a studio apartment and live by myself. This made finding a place even more difficult, but still I kept looking. I had an appointment to look at a studio in a building a little further north than I really wanted to live. The building was also very old and in a not-so-great part of town, so I wasn't really sure about this place. I told the building manager, though, that I would think about it, and I would get back to him soon. At that point, it was very dark outside. It was also very, very cold. It had started snowing as I began walking back to the train station. I was trying to save as much money as possible for moving, so I didn't take a bus back to the train station. It was a bit of a long walk, but the cold and snow didn't bother me at all. Since I was pretty far north in the city and it was snowing pretty hard outside at this point, there weren't a lot of people around. This was one of the reasons I had considered not wanting to move to this location. I wanted to be in an area with other people around me. I walked under the tunnel just before getting to the train station. I saw there was some guy who was leaning up against the wall under there. When he saw me, I could tell he was going to say something to me. I didn't like when people I don't know try to talk to me on the street. I thought he was going to ask for some change and I would simply give him some. I had my hand in my pocket in order to get some. However, instead, the guy asked me if I wanted to buy some drugs off him. I was caught off guard, needless to say. At the time, I didn't do anything, so I made an awkward comment and turned him down. It seemed like my awkward comment offended him, though. He got really angry at me really fast and started accusing me of disrespecting him. I tried to ignore him and went on my way, but that only seemed to make him even angrier at me. I was beginning to get scared and just wanted to get to the train station. The drug dealer demanded I stop and come back to him. I really thought the best thing I could do was just ignore him, but I was really wrong about that. That only got him even angrier at me. The guy suddenly grabbed me from behind, shocking me, and pushed me up against the wall of the tunnel. It was then I realized he had a knife on him. He held me up against the wall with the knife, talking about how I disrespected him. I denied doing so, telling him that I only wanted to get to my train and get home because it was so cold outside. That didn't seem to convince him, though. He was seriously angry at me. I don't know what I would have done if suddenly 3 people hadn't turned the corner and were walking under the tunnel now. The drug dealer very quickly hid the knife back in his coat, and moved away from me. He actually took the moment to move toward the three men, I assumed to try and sell some weed to them or something. I knew I was thrown a lifeline, and I took it. I quickly moved out of the tunnel and up the stairs to the train station. I went inside the small station, which had an attendant, so I was relatively sure I would be safe there. When the train eventually came, the drug dealer was on the platform watching me. I thought he was going to get on the train too, but he did not. He watched me as I sat down at the window and showed me his knife as the train sped away. Needless to say, I did not end up taking that apartment. After my parents got divorced, I really disliked being with my dad. My mom and dad still lived in the same neighborhood, although not really close together. I spent most of my time with my mom, although I did have a room at both of their houses. My dad had gotten really depressed after the divorce. He spent a lot of the time that I was with him drinking and not really paying much attention to me. I only spent the occasional weekend over at his place, and only when he really insisted on it. Since I was spending Christmas with my mom, he insisted I spend the weekend before Christmas over at his place. My parents arranged all of that. I was around 10 years old at the time. I think that's important to know if you're to understand some of the decisions I make in this story. It was a pretty lousy day ever since I walked home from school to my dad's place. It had been snowing pretty heavily all day long, so walking to the house caused my feet to get pretty soaked because of the snow. Once I arrived at my dad's place, he had already begun drinking, so the night was not going so great. The only thing I did like was the fact it was snowing outside. I sat at the window drinking hot chocolate and watching the snow fall. My dad drank so much that he eventually fell asleep in his easy chair. It wasn't unusual, but it made the night as bad as any other. I was only 10, and I really didn't know what to be doing in the house basically by myself. It wasn't the first time that I completely had to take care of myself, but I didn't really like it. It seemed like I was wasting my time and my night being here at this house. That's when I got the brilliant idea that I should just walk over to my mom's place. I had made the walk before. It was a bit long and I wasn't supposed to be out so late at night. Maybe my mom might be asleep or out of the house at the moment, but I could not stand spending any more time here with my passed out father. I bundled up as best as I could with what I had on hand, and then I set out into the snow. It had been really snowing hard, and it had been building up on the ground this whole time. That made it a much harder walk out there than it had been walking home from school, but I was determined to make it back to my mom's house. I was moving really slowly through the snow. As I walked by each streetlight, I saw just how hard and heavy it was really falling. A few times I felt I should turn back around and go back to my dad's house, but I figured it would be fine when I eventually made it home. I had gotten maybe about halfway when something happened. A door opened suddenly and an older man came out onto his porch. He started talking to me, asking me if I wanted to come into his house and get warm. He said it was way too cold and wet out there, and that if I came into his house, he could call my father for me to come and pick me up. I waved him off, telling him I was fine. I was just trying to get home, and I could make it there all on my own. And that was when he started offering me things like hot chocolate and fudge if I came into the house. He was making me feel uneasy. I was not supposed to talk to adults I didn't know. I wished I could have walked faster, but I would have had to walk in the street for that, and I wasn't allowed to do that either. I wanted to get away from this man. As I tried to go on, I kept note of him from the corner of my eye. The man began coming down his front walk quickly, coming right for me. I didn't think much about it, but I got scared out of my wits when he suddenly grabbed me by the arm. He started trying to pull me toward the front walk, and I knew he was trying to get me into his home. I was terrified, and I struggled my best to get away from him. I began screaming out and yelling at him to let me go, but the guy was dragging me, and he was a lot bigger than me. He was winning easily. There was no doubt he was going to get me inside his house. I got extremely lucky, however, as a snowplow just happened to be coming down the street at the same time. It caught the attention of the man dragging me. I was able to use the icy slickness of the sidewalk to knock him off balance and throw him onto his back. I then jumped over the snowbank separating the sidewalk from the road and in front of that snowplow. The man who grabbed me got up and started running back towards the house. The snowplow stopped and a big man got out of the cab. I ran over to him and told him the man in that house had just tried to abduct me and asked if he could help me out. The driver let me into his truck and used his phone to call the police. He waited in front of the house until they arrived, which took a while. When they arrived, they went and confronted the man in the house. He was arrested for attempting to abduct me. The police then took me to my mom's house. I did get in some trouble for attempting to walk in the first place. Mostly though, my parents were both happy nothing bad happened to me. That was the closest call I ever had in my life. I used to have this friend named Dan who was a lot like me. He was sort of a dark guy, wore all black all the time, kept his apartment dark all the time, and tended to spend an awful lot of his time by himself. I don't recall how the two of us actually started talking and eventually became friends. We weren't exactly the most social type. However, it did happen, and we became really good friends. Though we were close in age, Dan hadn't really gone through as much as I had in life. I'd been in many relationships, both good and bad. He had really spent most of his time alone. I seem to remember that maybe we met on a dating site or something like that and just decided to be friends instead. He met someone on the site maybe 6 months after the two of us became friends, and he became really enamored with them. However, his new love was pretty obvious to me as a game player. They lived in different states first of all. Whenever Dan tried to figure out a way to get them together, it would never work out. It was really just a bunch of drama, and I really couldn't tell Dan what I thought because I knew he would just get mad at me. Anyhow, the day it all came to a head was on a day where there was a blizzard. My job had shut down pretty early in the afternoon and canceled the following day of work as well. There were feet of snowfall expected. I drove through a lot of the heavy falling snow to get home and was planning on not even stepping foot out the front door for a few days. It was pretty late in the evening, around 11 p.m. or so, when I got a call from Dan. I hadn't heard from him a lot lately because he was so into his significant other. He seemed distressed on the phone though, and I could barely make out what he was talking about. He kept pleading with me to come over to his place because he didn't trust himself to be alone. I definitely didn't want to go out into the blizzard, but of course I had no problem doing so for a good friend. It was difficult to get over to Dan's place. The snow was falling even heavier than before, and it was hard to see anything at all. He didn't live very far from me, but it took me nearly until midnight just to get to his place. When I made it there, things began making a lot more sense. The person he was supposedly in love with had been playing some pretty sick games with him, although Dan couldn't quite see it that way at the moment. They were supposed to drive up to see Dan for the weekend, but claimed they had driven halfway and couldn't drive anymore. They went as far as telling him they were going to kill themselves in the car because they were so upset they couldn't finish the trip and come see him. Dan offered to go find them and pick them up, but they eventually hung up and stopped answering him altogether. Dan and I were there, as usual, hanging out in the dark in his apartment. There was an extremely strong negative energy in the air. I was doing all I could as a friend to simply try and console him, despite all the bad mojo he'd surrounded himself in. Eventually, although it was hard, I was able to get him to calm down enough that he dozed off for a while. I was laying in his bed watching over him while he fell asleep. Once that happened, I just kinda laid there in the dark, looking at the snow falling outside. I wasn't the type who could usually fall asleep in anyone else's bed, but I had to be there for my friend. I lay there watching the snow as he slept beside me. All of a sudden though, I thought I heard something in another part of the apartment. I didn't think it was anything at first. However, as I was lying there, several things happened at once that terrified me more than I'd ever been scared before. Suddenly, a light in the hallway outside Dan's bedroom turned on. I immediately looked over from the window. I turned my head just in time to see the shadow of someone walking by the doorway into the living room of the apartment. I'm not sure how long I laid there, frozen in terror. Someone had just broken in, but I couldn't figure out how it had happened with both of us there. I didn't know how to handle the problem either. Dan woke up and was groggy, asking me if I'd turned the light on. I told him no, and that I'd been in the bed the entire time. I thought someone was in the apartment. I was going to go and check it out. As soon as I said that, the light turned off. I'm not sure if it was because everything Dan had been through that night, but he immediately decided to take care of the issue instead. He got up and walked out of the room, turning the hallway light on. He then cautiously walked into the living room, and he was gone for quite a while. I was breathing heavily as I waited for anything to happen next. I expected to hear some sign of a struggle or some kind of violence. I didn't hear anything at all though. It was quite nerve-wracking, the waiting there. Finally, Dan came back to the room. He turned the hallway light off and came into the room and sat down on the bed. After a moment, he told me that not only was no one in the house, the bolt on his door appeared to still be locked. That meant that if someone had been in the apartment, they couldn't have just left because they couldn't lock the bolt once they had done so. I think if Dan hadn't seen the light turn off after he woke up, he might have thought I had turned the light on myself, but he witnessed it turning off and was just as confused as I was. After we allowed ourselves some time to process it, Dan thought his significant other had been playing with him the entire time. He thought the negative energy in his apartment had manifested that night into something supernatural. I don't think I believed that though. I mean, I clearly saw someone walking into the living room. I was sure someone was in that apartment that night. I wonder if they possibly may have gone out through the balcony somehow. We didn't find any footprints or anything in the snow there, so neither of us had any real idea of what we witnessed that night. Whatever it was though, it was incredibly scary for both of us. I was backpacking in Colorado years ago, near Crested Butte. It was late June, but was unusually cold. One afternoon, it clouded over, like there was going to be a big storm coming soon. And sure enough, there was. A thunder snowstorm. Anyway, one evening it was getting towards dark, and I found an open cabin. Nothing was in it really, just some bunks that were built into the walls. No other furniture or signs of occupation at all. I set up my tent nearby and waited to see if anyone came to stay inside. By dark, it was still empty though. There were no roads to reach this area either, so I assumed it was going to be vacant for the night. I put my sleeping bag down inside the bunk and tried to get to sleep. I should mention at this point there was a gravel path outside. Just as I was dozing off, I started to hear footsteps on the path. I sat up and turned on my flashlight. Hello? The footsteps stopped immediately. I got up and looked around outside, but I didn't see anyone there. I went back to my bedding, thinking I'd just mistaken the noise. Some minutes later though, I started to hear those footsteps again. Now I was really starting to freak out. I went out again, this time with my knife sheath out and in my hand. Again, there was nothing. I was shitting bricks at this point, but I went back to the bed since I didn't find anything. The next time I heard it, it sounded like it was inside. I frantically shot my flashlight in the direction of the noises, just in time to see the biggest fucking rat I'd ever seen. Bigger than my hand, probably. It darted away. I walked over with the flashlight to see where it had gone through. There was a hole in the wall that I discovered was insulated with styrofoam. This big-ass rat had eaten a hole through the entire wall. There were teeth marks all over it. The rat chewing through the building was what had been making that noise. I thought for sure I'd stumbled into some crazy lone wolf's place or something.